Welcome, guys. We've had the final Dutch Grand Prix, and what a race we got after the dreadful sprint race. Who would have thought that Sunday would have turned out like it did? And it's probably given us one of the hardest weekends of the season to rate, because if you're looking at Sunday's finishing order, you miss half of the story. George Russell won the sprint, but he didn't win the race. Fernando Alonso from 18th and somehow scoring points in that dog of a car. Nico Hülkenberg started 13th and effectively won the midfield race, getting himself up into P8. Yuki Tsunoda returned, jumped completely into a new car, something he's unfamiliar with the 26 cars, and he was immediately competitive, and he's asked for people to get on the ringer to him. Max Verstappen's final home Grand Prix was over before he even completed a proper racing lap. So these ratings, they're not just about Sunday. This was a sprint race weekend, which means we take over and look at every aspect, the sprint, qualifying, sprint race, qualifying and the main race, alongside obviously the race pace, mistakes, overtakes, time management, strategy, teammate comparisons, what each driver actually had underneath them. And yes, we'll start, like always, with the race winner. Let's get to it. Welcome, guys. If you're new to the channel, please hit the subscribe button, and if you enjoyed the video, hit the like. Driver ratings time, Zandvoort, and like I said, we start with the race winner, Lando Norris. Well, what a weekend for him. Sprint qualifying was a brilliant P2. The race, P3, qualifying on pole, won the race from pole, but it's not as straightforward as that. It's almost the perfect weekend for him, wasn't it? He missed out on sprint pole by less than half a tenth of a second to George Russell, and then Monday or Saturday morning exposed McLaren's weakness, and you thought, oh, this might be a problem for them for the rest of the weekend, especially when it comes race day. They struggled with the rear tyre deck in the sprint. Lando Norris lost second place to Charles Leclerc late on in the sprint race. And I think that makes his Grand Prix performance even more impressive. McLaren made changes before proper qualifying, and Norris responded with pole position. And then on Sunday, the first start went perfectly well. The second, not so. Kimi Antonelli took the lead at the restart, and then it looked like he might not have the pace of the Mercedes, but once Norris got onto them hard tyres, the McLaren absolutely came alive, and he reeled Antonelli back in, committed to the outside of turn one for what Norris himself said was the move that won him the race, and eventually regained the lead. But then the real impressive part, I think, came when Kimi Antonelli stopped under the late virtual safety car for fresh soft tyres, and Norris stayed out. He had 15 lap older hard tyres, and the tyre deck was enough where we thought, and we've seen with the Ferraris, the 7-8 lap difference on tyres meant, you know, you were reeling the guy ahead of you in pretty quickly. But he didn't. Antonelli had the faster, fresher tyres, but Norris still pulled away and won by more than 11 seconds. Pole victory and an important overtake to take the lead as well and win the race. He solved the tyre problems that hurt him in the sprint. I think this could arguably one of Lando Norris's best race wins. It puts him right up there. No mistakes like we've seen at times from him. A flawless weekend in parts, apart from the sprint race. But a great drive on Sunday. I'm giving him a 10 out of 10. Next up, Kimi Antonelli. And, well, he didn't win the Dutch Grand Prix, but there was a lot to like about this weekend for him. Qualifying for the sprint didn't go too well. The mistake cost him and put him down into P5. Then the recovery started for him, immediately past Oscar Piastri, and then in the closing stages, pressuring Norris for third as well. Finished P4 there in the end. That was tough, but qualifying he was better. He was third, but only by 0.031 behind George Russell for qualifying. And despite a small mistake at turn one that cost him probably even a shot at pole position. I think his restarts or his race starts both times were absolutely nailed on. It's the first time we've seen Kimi Antonelli get these right. It's mistakes that he's made or the difficult part of his race weekends earlier in the season. But this weekend, he was phenomenal. From third on the grid, he launched past George Russell at the first start and then Norris to take the lead of the Grand Prix at the restart. And it just wasn't a ceremonial lead, was it? He stayed there and was there for a substantial portion of the race, and he forced Norris to try and go and take this win from him. Eventually, his rear tyres struggled. I think that Norris allowed Norris back into the fight, and then the late virtual safety car gave him and Mercedes to put on that fresh softs, and they switched Antonelli ahead of Russell because he had the faster tyres and the better pace. But he couldn't catch Norris, and P4 in the sprint, P3 in qualifying, leading the race. Finishing second, stretches his championship lead over his teammate George Russell after not a great sprint. The weekend sort of came to him and he was better. Mercedes just had no answer for McLaren when Norris was in them hard. He was on another level. I'm surprised at how slow the Mercedes were on the soft tyres, but we'd seen the Ferraris pick that soft tyre, and I don't think that was the tyre for the race. And I think eventually they just ran out of tyres because they would have probably have liked to stick on a medium or a fresh hard if they'd had one. The whole George Russell inversion, well, I think that's just down to the team. Toto Wolff said that was a hard decision to make and he had to make it. Let's see if the boot is on the other foot. If Kimi has to move out the way for George Russell, but I think that's more of a George problem than an Antonelli problem. For me, for this weekend, I'm giving him a 9 out of 10. Third place man, George Russell, and he's bounced back this weekend. It's probably the best example of why rating need to cover the entire weekend, because if you just look at the race, you might be disappointed with a P3 finish, but sprint qualifying, pole position, the sprint win, he looked in control, just missed out on pole position qualifying, and his Saturday morning and Friday evening were basically perfect, weren't they? Absolutely brilliant start, excellent time management, and controlled the sprint victory. And then, yeah, the second in sprint for the qualifying, he beat his teammate. But then Sunday just wasn't quite strong enough. I don't think he was helped. It was a bit unlucky at the start. He started on the first start on the really wet side of the grid, and that cost him a position to Kimi Antonelli. And then when the roles were reversed, when second place Kimi Antonelli lined up there, it was bone dry. So another bad start for him, and he lost that position to Kimi. And I think that was the bit of the kick there, because he didn't get then the better of the Mercedes strategy call. He never looked quite threatening for victory throughout this race, but I think, well, you can ask him. It's a difficult one for him. Mercedes asked him to release Kimi Antonelli, who had the fresh softs, and they left George vulnerable. So it's a question for the team here. They seem to just favoured Kimi and just forgot about George Russell and his strategy altogether. The reason they said they pit Antonelli onto the VSC because they said they had a free pit stop to the Ferraris. George might have been in trouble to them, but I'm not sure quite by that. Both Ferraris pit, and I thought George Russell would do that as well then, and be on the better tyres, but he held off the Ferraris brilliantly. Mercedes, Toto praised his defence, saying that staying out rather than slipping under the VSC was basically his only chance of preserving the podium, according to the team. Sprint pole, sprint victories, front row Sunday, Grand Prix podium. The biggest talking point really here for George Russell is the team order that came, and he was pretty accepting of it, surprisingly so, just towing the party line on that one. I was surprised at that. I mean, not the normal aggressive George Russell that we know. A lot more calmer, took it on the chin, and is that just a power play? Is that the way the dynamics are within the team? As it stands, I'm not too sure about it. Toto saying it was discussed on the morning of the race, and is that why it wasn't really much drama played out from George Russell's side? He did query it, like, is Kimi going on for the win? But Kimi definitely wasn't going on for the win. George Russell held the Ferraris back, and Antonelli was on the same type of soft tyres, so he could have held Kimi back. And it's a fight between the two for the championship. Mercedes saying that, they were protecting the positions. I don't think Kimi was particularly under the threat from the Ferraris. They had similar pace, so and he had fresher tyres. It's not like Kimi was on older tyres. The only threat was to George Russell. And he was under threat anyway. He just held on and did a great job defensively. So I'm not sure I quite buy the Mercedes story on that one, but great job defensively from George Russell. This is, on the whole, a really good, positive weekend for him, much needed. And he hoping just to bounce on from here. I'm giving him a 9 out of 10. Fourth place man, Lewis Hamilton, and his weekend got better as it progressed. He was 7th in qualifying for the sprint and in the sprint race. It wasn't particularly spectacular at all, but the Ferrari had genuine place, particularly in the hands of Charles Leclerc. So Lewis was leaving something on the table there for the sprint, but in the proper qualifying, he turned that around. Lewis said that the setup direction for the sprint went in the wrong way. Better for qualifying, but not as good as it wanted to be. And it was a bad qualifying, really, because he qualified 5th and he beat his teammate. But in the Grand Prix, it was probably the best session of the weekend. And Lewis had really good pace. And I think if he'd been further up the field, he could have been fighting for a victory here. He extended his first stint, and then he actually led the race while others around him stopped, and the longer strategy gave him the fresher tyres later on. I think they let him out a little bit too long at the end. He was asking, am I a guinea pig here? What are you doing? You've just left me out. And I think the question was the thought was that they'd let him just run to the end. Interestingly enough, that Fred Vasseur said after the race that that might have been a mistake to pit him, and they probably could have tried the one stop for Lewis. And he might have finished higher up, or at least ahead of George Russell, who was struggling on his tyres as well, and Lewis would have had track position there. But Lewis had significantly older tyres than George, so not sure there. I think the question really is the choice of the softs and the worn softs for Lewis. If you had a set of mediums and hards, that was clearly the tyre for the race. So I'm not sure why they didn't go for one of them. Late in the Grand Prix, all over the back of George Russell. The one chance he really got to pass George, we got the VSC for the 2 Williams incident. And it's a good weekend. There was real pace from the Ferrari. They finished, just 0.8 behind the Mercedes, with Charles Leclerc another half a second back, but they just couldn't find the move for the podium. I think that's what stops this probably becoming a 9 for Lewis, but from P7 in both sprint sessions to P5 in qualifying and 4th in the race, and what should have been probably a podium, I think that was a strong upward trajectory for him in the race, so I'm giving him an 8 out of 10. 5th place man, Charles Leclerc, and his was the complete opposite to Lewis. Great start to the weekend, P3 in the sprint qualifying, 2nd in the sprint race, but qualifying not great, P6 and then a P5 on Sunday. I don't think the result on Sunday told the story of his race, because Friday was basically excellent, 3rd, and a great sprint race. He was just half a tenth away from pole position, so had the pace for potentially pole. And then in the sprint, he made the soft tyre work absolutely brilliantly well. Questioning that start on the softs, he was one of the only top 15 drivers. It was only Berman that was on the softs with him. But then Norris's mediums faded, and Charles Leclerc hunted him down and took the pass to finish in 2nd place. Probably one of the strongest individual performances on Saturday morning. The problem really came for the qualifying for the Grand Prix. 6th was disappointing compared to where he'd been and the early pace he'd shown in the weekend. And I think that cost him track position for Sunday. And He was a properly aggressive racer, wasn't he? All Sunday, he produced some excellent overtaking passes around the outside of Oscar Piastri, and then spent much of the time threatening Mercedes. The Ferrari execution wasn't perfect for him either. He lost a position at the restart and then had a slow pit stop. The VSC timing, I don't think particularly helped him either. Other than that, it was a very good weekend. 6th in qualifying, 5th in the race. Just wasn't quite elite level, but strong sprint, which gives him equal points to Lewis Hamilton, an 8 out of 10. 6th place man, Oscar Piastri, and, well, average weekend for him, considering where his teammate finished. Qualified 4th in the sprint, finished 5th in the sprint, qualified 4th for the race, finished 6th in the race, so went backwards in both races. It's a difficult one to score, isn't it? Because there was fast lists of some excellent performances. 4th in sprint qualifying was pretty solid. 4th again in qualifying for the Grand Prix was not too bad, but considering his teammate was on pole, I think there was more in this car. I think he produced one of the best moves of Sunday race when he went round and passed George Russell briefly for 3rd, but then overall the weekend never really came to anything. I questioned the strategy call for him and McLaren on Sunday because he was on the hard tyres and he pit just around the same time as George Russell is to cover him, and I thought that was a big mistake because the hard tyre was the tyre of the race, and McLaren ruined his strategy, I think, from there onwards, and it just made it really difficult for him. He had a slow stop as well, and that dropped him behind George Russell, all at that same time. Charles Leclerc passed him, Lewis Hamilton passed him. And suddenly the other McLaren was 6th in his hands while Norris was fighting for victory. McLaren stressed that the finish position was completely representative. The slow stop hurt him and the car wasn't completely representative, I should say. The slow stop hurt him and the car struggled to activate the hard tyres. And Piastri himself said after the race that the pace just simply disappeared during the middle part of the race. Norris winning the identical machinery makes it inevitably that is going to affect his score for a low one, but a decent weekend for him. I'm giving him a 7 out of 10. 7th place man, Liam Lawson, and first time in a Red Bull sprint, qualifying 11th, finished there in the sprint race, qualified 8th for the race and finished 7th, and probably one of the most underrated performances of the entire weekend. He was thrown back into the Red Bull at very short notice for the injured Hadjar. And this is Zandvoort. This is a circuit where confidence in the car matters massively. And he looked to improve on his sprint race in proper qualifying. He put the Red Bull in P8, around a 10th back of Max Verstappen, and I thought that was absolutely brilliant from him. Especially he's completely unfamiliar with this car on short notice. To be that close to Max, I thought was absolutely brilliant. And then Sunday became about maximising what Red Bull had. Verstappen crashed out immediately. Lawson kept it on track. He didn't have the pace to fight the McLarens, Mercedes or Ferraris, so eventually it basically just drove a lonely race and finished 7th, best of the rest, behind the 6th car from the 3 strongest teams. He did get a 10-second penalty for not slowing enough under the red flag. I think there's a blemish on his weekend, and that might prevent me giving him a higher score, but for a standing performance in a difficult Red Bull, is it the difficult Red Bull that we know? As we get a fly coming in my face. But I thought it was a very impressive weekend for Liam Lawson. Considering he's completely new to this car. It's just a shame that Max went out because we didn't get a true comparator with his teammate to see exactly how strong a performance he put in, but I'm giving him an 8 out of 10. 8th place man, Nico Hülkenberg, a sprint qualifying of 14th, didn't finish the sprint, qualified 13th, finished the race in 8th place, and this this is where simply looking at qualifying, it would probably mislead you. Hülkenberg Saturday was pretty miserable. 14th in sprint qualifying as well. A power problem ruined his sprint. And then only P13 in proper qualifying. And then Sunday was absolutely outstanding. The opening lap was chaotic. Bortoleto spun on the final corner directly ahead of him. And a brilliant save from him to somehow miss his teammate. And after the restart, he was 12th, and from there on, he went racing. Brilliant passes on Pierre Gasly and Yuki Tsunoda. If you watch my reactions in the watch-along, he fought through the midfield and put that Audi in P8, best of the rest. He did the job on track, overtakes. Audi's own assessment was that Hülkenberg essentially muscled his way through the field with the basically excellent overtakes and then controlled the gap behind. He started 13th, his teammate started 9th, yet Hülkenberg finished 8th, Bortoleto 13th. And this is the kind of performance that we probably should reward, not because P8 sounds impressive, but because of how he got there. And so I'm giving him a 9 out of 10. 9th place man, Fernando Alonso, and this is crazy to say he's finished in 9th place. Sprint qualifying last, sprint race 18th, qualifying 18th. And somehow a P9 in the race Friday. And if you were rating it on Friday and Saturday alone, he'd be nowhere near a 9, would he? He's last in sprint qualifying, 18th in the race, and then 18th for qualifying. I mean, this rating system has to recognize exceptional racing performance in weak machinery, and Fernando Alonso has produced one hell of a race performance there, hasn't he? Started 18th, finished 9th in Aston Martin. He used the red flag to change tyres, and that changed his strategy also. And his management from there was absolutely exceptional. At one stage, he did a 37-lap stint. And then late in the race, he had Pierre Gasly in a much improved Alpine, sitting within half a second of him. Gasly probably had the quicker Alpine and it was all over the back of Fernando Alonso, but Alonso is the master at defensive driving, puts his car in exactly the right place. And Aston Martin said themselves that they'd not expected really points from where they started, yet Fernando Alonso brings home 2 championship points. The sole man that's bringing points in this team. Stroll retired after spending the race struggling badly with the car. And that makes the comparison with Fernando Alonso look even better. This is a classic Fernando Alonso drive. The weekend probably wasn't perfect when you look at the first parts of it, but the Sunday performance was huge. A brilliant performance. I'm thinking 9, but I could almost give it a 10 out of 10, and I probably will. I'm giving him a 10 out of 10. It was brilliant. 10th place man, Pierre Gasly, the sprint qualifying P8 sprint race, finished there P8, qualified 11th, finished the race 10th for the final point. He had probably a strong weekend. They'd bought a huge upgrade package on this car, and then I think he made the most of it. P8 in sprint qualifying and then the sole point for P8 in the sprint. I think that was a good result for him. Best of the rest again. Alpine qualifying was a bit disappointing. Missed out on Q3 in proper qualifying and a P11. And then Sunday started well, gained positions, immediately was up to P8 before having to take evasive action for Max Verstappen crash. And from there his race became an endless midfield fight. Nico Hülkenberg got through, the Racing Bulls got through, they teamed up and passed him, and eventually Gasly found himself trying to chase down Fernando Alonso for 9th, and he just spent much of that closing phase within half a second of Fernando Alonso, but couldn't find a way through. Still scored in both the sprint and the Grand Prix. I think that's probably a successful weekend for him. I'm giving him an 8 out of 10. 11th place man, Yuki Tsunoda, the man we love and so happy to see back on the grid. Sad for Isaac Hadjar, but brilliant to see Yuki back. And what a weekend for him. Sprint qualifying 12th, sprint race 13th. just dropped a position at the start there, qualified 12th and finished the race P11, just missed out on points. And I think context matters here massively for Yuki Tsunoda. He hasn't raced a 2026 F1 car before this weekend. And this generation is completely different in terms of how the car behaves, how the power needs to be managed, what the driver has to do. And he had one practice session before sprint qualifying. That's it. Yet he qualified P12. Racing Bulls described it as a superb effort considering the circumstances. And the really interesting part is how rapidly Cole closed the gap to Arvid Lindblad, who's not been a slouch this season. And Yuki began the weekend more than 8 tenths behind his teammate in practice. In Q1 in proper qualifying, he was just 11 thousandths away. And the 2Q gap was just over a tenth. And then Sunday he went racing. He passed Gasly with a brilliant move there. You can see me jumping for joy in the watch along for that one. And then he spent a significant part of the race fighting directly behind or in the midfield. He had one off-track moment which set him back, and then finished 11th ahead of his teammate though, Lindblad. Yes, he had a penalty, and we'll get to that. But considering Yuki's lack of experience with this car and how many good drivers have struggled to adapt to the 2026 gen, and getting this close this quickly, I think you've got to say is massively impressive. His team boss called the performance for the one race standing phenomenal. So although he missed out on the points by a place, this was a brilliant weekend for him. He gave a shout out to the grid. Call me, said Yuki to every team principal on that grid. Yes, everybody, call him, listen to Yuki, get him back on the grid. He's shown what a brilliant racing driver he is. He's loved by the fans. It'd be great to see him back. And it'd be a shame if it's just this one brilliant cameo that we get from him. Absolutely loved to watch him, see him back on the track. And I think he's done his chances of getting back into a car no harm at all this weekend. I'm giving him an 8 out of 10. 12th place man, Arvid Lindblad, sprint qualifying 10th and finished the sprint race in 10th, qualified 10th, and then finished the race in 10th. He had a lot going on this weekend, and this probably was his first time at Zandvoort as well. Never raced here before, and on a sprint weekend where you've just got 1 hour of practice before qualifying, you got to look at the consistency. It's pretty solid. Top 10s in 3 sessions, and then I think that's excellent one-lap execution, you've got to say there. And then the important details from Sunday, I think we need to get right here. After Verstappen's crash, the restart order was taken from the end of lap 1. He started P8, although he did show as being mysteriously lower down at the restart. And what destroyed his race is what happened next, really. He was Lindblad had overtaken Gasly in the double yellow flag zone during the chaos around Verstappen's crash, and the stewards gave him a drive-through penalty, and that dropped him from the points positions right towards the back. And then from there, his recovery, you've got to say, was actually pretty good. He overtook cars, he showed strong pace, later played a useful team role by holding up Gasly for Yuki, who helped Yuki get ahead of him. And Lindblad said it was one of his strongest races of the season in terms of pace and overtaking commitment. Without the penalty, he said he would have finished P8, and I think that was probably possible considering the pace he had. And judging where he was in the restart, I think that was it wasn't unrealistic because he was in the top 10 positions, but I think it was that yellow flag infringement. It was his mistake, and it's cost him a points finish, and so there's no points for the Racing Bulls this weekend. They've been picking up points consistently. So yeah, great pace, excellent qualifying consistency, and a rookie-ish rare error from him. But you can't give him too much of a down rating for that, so I'm giving him a 7 out of 10. 13th place man, Gabi Bortoleto, and well, his race week started actually pretty well, didn't he? P9 in qualifying the sprint and qualifying for the main race, 13th for the race in the end. 3 straight 9th places in an Audi. I think that's pretty good consistency. Then Sunday ravelled pretty quickly, didn't he? Had a poor getaway, dropped him from 9th down to 14th, and then came the Verstappen incident. And he reacted to the smoke and the chaos ahead and made a correction at the final banking and spun. He avoided the wall. Nico Hülkenberg narrowly avoided him as well, but that dropped him all the way down to P18. And from there, he recovered to 13th, which I think deserves some credit. But when your teammate starts 4 places ahead of you and you finish 5 points and he finishes 5 places ahead of you, I think that Sunday mistake really hurt him, and it probably should hurt him in the ratings. Saturday was good, Sunday wasn't. I'm giving him a 6 out of 10. 14th place man, Franco Colapinto, and qualified 13th, sprint 12th, qualified 14th and 14th in the race. You've got to remember, though, he didn't have the big upgrade that his teammate had. He actually started the race well. He qualified 14th, but gained 4th positions at the start and put himself into the points. But it would have been a very respectable afternoon if that was to happen. But instead, the penalty ruined his race. Like Lindblad, Colapinto, he undertook under the yellow flags on the lap what chaos, and they got a drive for the penalty. Unlike Lindblad, that wasn't the end of his problems, though, because later in the race he received another yellow flag, a 10-second penalty for a yellow flag infringement. So 2 in 1 race. It's difficult to excuse. The first one, he struggled for tyre grip and never recovered after the first penalty, and then eventually he just finished exactly where he started in a P14. There was decent underlying pace. The opening lap was good, but I think better execution was needed, and the 2 penalties is disappointing. I'm giving him a 5 out of 10. 15th place man, Sergio Perez, and qualified for the sprint 21st, finished there in 21st for the sprint race, qualified 22nd and finished the Grand Prix 15th. The Cadillac just wasn't competitive around here. Perez's Sunday results make that pretty obvious, doesn't it? 21st in both sprint sessions and dead last in proper qualifying. They then chose to make some setup changes that meant Perez started the race from the pit lane, and his Grand Prix was better. He made some progress. He used the overcut to get ahead of Bottas. And then the team felt a late VSC arrived at an unfortunate moment for him, and removed an opportunity that he'd been building towards. He eventually finished 15th, so Sunday wasn't terrible, but 21st, 22nd across the previous sessions mean that this just wasn't a strong weekend for him. Not the worst, though, so I'm giving it a 5 out of 10. 16th place man, Carlos Sainz, sprint qualifying 18th, the sprint race 20th. Sprint for the qualifying for the main race 17th, 16th in the Grand Prix, and this was probably a weekend to forget for Sainz. Williams just didn't have a good car around Zandvoort. They even relative to that limitation, you've got to say Carlos Sainz struggled P18 in sprint qualifying. He started the sprint from the pit lane after they changed his setup and essentially just used the race or the sprint race at least, as an extended test session. He finished 20th. Proper qualifying, he only got 17th behind Albon. Sunday, some brief hope. He ran his first in and actually got himself up into the top 10 through a strategy cycle. Looked good for the moments he was there, but then came the major mistake late in the race. He attacked turn 1 on very worn tyres, locked up on the bump and hit his own teammate. It caused Albon to retire. The stewards blamed Sainz and gave him a 10-second penalty for the friendly fire. And a difficult weekend for Williams, where they needed to maximise whatever was possible to try and make themselves get up the grid. But taking your teammate out, I think, just really rounds off a difficult weekend for him. A 4 out of 10. 17th place man, Alex Albon, and his sprint qualifying 16th, sprint race 16th, qualified 16th, and a DNF. Was 17th. The results do say that, but it was a DNF. I don't think that reflects Albon's driving. The Williams just wasn't competitive. James Vowles admitted the team's car lacked pace. I think 16th qualifying and he beat Sainz is good. I think Valls praised Albon's Q2 lap as well and said he's basically just extracted everything out of the car, and Sunday just wasn't perfect strategically. I think Albon felt that Williams just reacted too early to potential undercut rather than running their own race, and that dropped him into traffic. Blue flags and dirty air, but then eventual retirement came. Wasn't his fault at all with the Sainz lockup. But there isn't much on the result sheets for him, is there? It was overall not a great weekend for him. But relative to machinery, he beat his teammate, and I think he's done a reasonable job. I'm giving him a 6 out of 10. 18th place man, Valtteri Bottas, qualified 20th, sprint 19th, which was good from him. Qualifying for the main race 20th and a DNF. Like Perez, Bottas was stuck with a Cadillac that just didn't enjoy Zandvoort. 20th in the sprint qualifying. Sunday was slightly better. His first stint was actually respectable. He managed to stay around the Williams cars. Perez got ahead of him through strategy, and then with 10 laps to go, a hydraulics problem affected the rear wing, but they had no option to retire him. I'm not marking him down for the DNF. That's outside of his control. But there just wasn't enough performance before the failure to justify a strong rating for Valtteri, and I'm giving him a 5 out of 10. 19th place man, Esteban Ocon, sprint qualifying 15th sprint race, 14th, qualified 15th, a DNF for him as well. It's pretty straightforward, wasn't it, really? Nothing disastrous, but also nothing to suggest he was extracting a huge amount more than the Haas had available. On Sunday, reliability ended his race. He completed most of the race before pulling over with the Haas. I think there was a power unit issue for him. And Ocon admitted himself that they were really weren't really in contention for points even before the failure. So no down rating for the DNF, but there just wasn't enough anywhere else in the weekend for him to give him a great score. I'm giving him a 5 out of 10. 20th place, Lance Stroll, qualified 19th, sprint 17th, qualified 19th, and then a DNF in the race. Another difficult weekend for him. The car is clearly still not easy to drive, especially over one lap. I think the comparison to Fernando Alonso is pretty difficult to ignore, though, weren't they? They both started deep in the midfield. Fernando ended 9th, Stroll retired. I think the Sunday problems weren't entirely down to him. He picked up early damage in the race, did Stroll, and then he just complained of having no grip and sliding badly, and then they eventually retired the car because of the handling problem. It's again, P19 in both qualifying sessions. I mean, the weekend has just been underwhelming for Stroll, and you can't put away that Fernando's just got a P9 in that car, so was it that bad come race day? Yes, he had damage. I'm giving him a 5 out of 10. Ollie Berman, difficult weekend for him. Qualified 17th, sprint 15th. Qualified for the main race 20th, DNF'd. And his Sunday was basically over before it even started. Made it a decent getaway initially, and then completed the opening lap before Verstappen's crash. And then on the formation lap, he suddenly broke down and just couldn't restart it. Race over before the race even got underway. I think he caused the go around again, wasn't he? The second formation lap. The team did say later that it was a power unit failure, so no blame for him there. Unfortunately, the early sessions weren't great for him. 17th, 15th, and then 20th behind Ocon again. There was an explanation for some of what that qualifying performance was all about, and Haas said it was traffic and tyre prep that compromised him, but ultimately it just wasn't enough here to reward him a decent result. I'm giving him a 4 out of 10. Last but not least, Max Verstappen, qualified 6th, sprint 6th, qualified for the main race 7th, and then a DNF. This one is a difficult weekend for him. The entire weekend, the Red Bull absolutely struggled around this circuit. 6th was the best he could do. 7th in proper qualifying. I think Red Bull admitted after the race that the car just seems to have taken a step backwards compared with the rounds before the summer break. So those Saturday results probably weren't actually awful. He was still extracting respectable positions from a difficult car. And then Sunday happened. The conditions were slippery, and Verstappen had already made contact with Lewis and Lawson in the chaotic opening lap. And then he approached to the final corner. He got into this slippery painted white line while accelerating, and the rear end snapped. He lost control, hit the barrier heavily. So lucky that it was not worse for him. And the race was over before completing a timed lap. And yes, that part of the track was genuinely treacherous. Lawson, directly behind him, talked about how easy it was to lose the car there. We've seen 3 twitches from Gabby Bortoleto. Gasly nearly lost it as well there. But crashing out on your home Grand Prix on lap 1, I think that carries a significant weight when it comes to rating. Respectable Saturday, but yeah, it was all down to him and his mistake, which is super rare for Max Verstappen, but it happens. I'm giving him a 4 out of 10. So that's it after the final Dutch Grand Prix. Well, just a handful of 10s there, isn't it? We'll get through and do a predictions review because as I pull that up, some really good performances. Lando Norris, going through the final verdicts. Pole victory. Probably one of the best overtaking moves of the race. Kimi Antonelli took the lead and pushed Norris, finishing second. I don't think it was Kimi's best weekend, but a really good result. George, sprint pole, sprint victory, much to be happy about for him. Nico Hülkenberg, a brilliant P8. Fernando Alonso, somehow a P9. And Yuki, you're going to give him some words of credit here. Serious amounts of credit. With an 8 scoring in the ratings. Let's hope he can get into the car. But on those driver ratings, who have I been harsh on? Who have I rated too highly? Get in the comments on that one. And who was the driver of the weekend? Let me know in your comments quickly through my predictions review. Well, I had a Kimi Antonelli. We'll start with third. Lewis Hamilton, I had for third for sprint qualifying. Lando Norris second, and Kimi Antonelli for pole. Charles Leclerc took third, Norris second, and George Russell with the sprint pole there. For the sprint race, I had Norris to finish third, Hamilton second, and Kimi Antonelli in first. It was Norris third, Charles Leclerc with a brilliant overtake to get second, and George Russell in first for his sprint win. Good to see him on the top step again. Then comes qualifying for the main race. I had Verstappen third, Charles Leclerc second, and Antonelli for pole position. Antonelli did get third, Russell second, and Lando Norris took pole. And then comes race day. For third place, I had Norris, Verstappen second, and I thought Antonelli would win it. George Russell third, Kimi Antonelli second, and Lando Norris in first place. So at least I got 2 drivers correct that would on the top steps, just not in the orders that I probably want. Not the best driver predictions for me this weekend, but there we have it after a quite brilliant Zandvoort race. I didn't expect that, with predicting a horrible one for the watch along on Sunday after the sprint was pretty dead, wasn't it? But it delivered an absolute spectacular. Shame we won't be going there for the foreseeable future. Let's hope they can find their way back onto the grid. And next up, Monza. Penalties to talk about before that, so there'll be a race review coming shortly on Monza. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, comment. As always, see you on the next one.